All right, so welcome to our panel this morning on teacher preparation accountability. I'm Stephen Sawchuk, and I'm an associate editor with Education Week, and I have three great thinkers on this topic with me this morning. So from left is Kate Walsh, who is the president of the National Council on Teacher Quality. A lot of you may remember that for the past 2 years, NCTQ has released a project that tries to score all of the nation's preparation programs on a set of standards that kicked up absolutely no controversy at all, right, Kate?
They love me.
Next to Kate is Segun Eubanks, who's the president. I'm giving you a promotion. Sorry. Who's the director of teacher quality for the National Education Association, which is the largest union in America, 3 million members. And finally, to my left is Jim Cibulka, who is the president of the Council for Accreditation of Educator Preparation, CAPE. And I want to say just a few words about CAPE. So accreditation, the subject matter accreditation of teacher preparation programs in the U.S. is largely voluntary. There's about a dozen states where it's required, but it's mostly voluntary. And CAPE issued new standards that over time will require programs seeking the seal of approval to take higher caliber candidates. We heard a little bit about selection yesterday. And also show that they're effective over time. So it's a big change also. And I hope that some of you will ask for some of those details as we get into our discussion this morning. So first of all, I'm going to ask some questions, and then we'll turn it over to you. But one thing that occurs to me, especially as I've been covering teacher preparation over the last, 8 years, that makes me feel kind of old. But we have Kate's review, which was largely contested by programs. We have states having their own standards for teacher preparation. We have the new CAPE standards. So in other words, information on these programs is simultaneously kind of hard to find and also thrown at us from all sides. There's an incredible variety of standards. How do you make these confusing standards, these overlapping, these conflicting standards, how do you make all that information more useful for parents and taxpayers? I'll start with Jim, and then let's go to Kate and hear her perspective on this too.
Well, I think first of all, when you're looking at all of these standards, and I agree that it is a problem historically in our field, you need to ask who developed the standards, and then you need to ask whether the standards do in fact focus on performance, because that's really what's important here, the performance of the candidates, both during the program and after they graduate, and the performance of the programs. So in that regard, CAPE represents the voice of the profession, broadly construed. And this is quite different from standard setting that you'd find in other countries, where the government essentially sets the standards for the profession. And so last year when CAPE's board established these new standards, it was speaking for all of the stakeholders, including critics that are part of our profession. So that's something that I think is an important point, because I believe moving forward, what we need to do is strengthen the education profession. We need to emulate what medicine, law, and other mature professions do. The answer is not to pile on more and more regulation at the government level, although government has its place. And then the other thing I would just say is that these standards do focus very much on performance, on the kinds of people who we admit to the programs, on the depth of their content knowledge and how they can teach it to diverse learners, particularly around college and career-ready standards, on how these graduates perform in the classroom once they're out, and the quality of the instruction that they provide. So we're looking at impact after they leave the programs, how they're prepared with regard to clinical preparation, and finally, whether these programs actually are data-based, whether they use evidence to judge the quality of their programs and make improvements. This is a huge shift from the way in which teacher preparation has operated in the past. So, I think those two things, who set the standards, and do the standards, in fact, raise the bar about performance for the candidates and for the programs themselves.
Can you hear me okay? I mean, I have a different take than your question suggests, Steve. I think there's remarkably little confusion because I think there's almost no information out there about the quality of programs. A lot of information is collected, but almost none of it is meaningful to me as a parent, me as an aspiring teacher, or me as a school district that wants to hire. So that's the void we're trying to fill with our standards. We're very much looking at what the qualities of a program ought to be if it's really going to serve the needs of future teachers and school districts that need to hire well-trained teachers. That being said, I think accreditation is an extremely important feature to any profession, including teacher preparation. I think it's important that people in this room understand that teacher education is the only field I have ever found where half the programs in this country are not accredited nationally by their own profession. That's not true for nursing, engineering, or anywhere. So this is a field that is basically the Wild West. And Jim and Cape is trying to bring order to it. But that effort is, at this moment, it is, I won't call it aspirational because that sounds like it's unrealistic, but it's something that's intended to happen, but it hasn't happened yet. Mm-hmm. And certainly, in some of the things that Cape hopes to collect on programs, we'd be very supportive of them getting, but there are definitely some challenges, just pragmatic challenges in getting some of the data that we need on programs. So, but the bottom line is there's almost no information that anybody can use that tells you whether program A is better than program B.
So, Kate, you would say that we are collecting information, but it's not useful, it's not what we need, and it's not easily accessible.
So I think it's so simple. If you had to look somewhere for information about programs in your community and their quality and what they're delivering, where would you go? I mean, you could try to go to the Title II website and you would learn almost nothing. The other thing is, I mean, as important as accreditation is, it's going to tell you that you are accredited or you're not. It's not going to tell you you're the best, if I've got it right, unless you've changed the structure. But it's a binary decision. So I still don't know, okay, so I'm only going to go to an accredited program. Well, I want to get to, am I wrong, Jim?
No, it is going to be more than a binary system.
Currently it's not, but great if it's something else.
With a lot of performance information published by the institutions and by CAPE that will allow consumers to really get the kind of information that you're right, we don't have right now.
I mean, can you require this information, Jim, to be put on just the school's website?
Yes.
As a reporter, I can tell you, trying to find out this information, it's never,
yes,
right up on the splash page, right?
Yes. They already have to, but we're really clamping down on
hold their feet to the fire.
Where they publish this information and on 8 annual reporting measures that are, over time, going to be comparable.
So yesterday, actually, Caitlin Emma, my friend from Politico, raised the issue of value-added and test score data as being, one possible way of trying to figure out whether the teachers that these programs graduate are going on to help kids learn more. My read of the research on this is that there's actually a lot of debate in the field about whether you can use these sort of test score algorithms for judging program quality, but certainly that's something that could very likely show up in the federal regulations that are supposed to come out later this week. CAPE wants programs to be attentive to academic performance of K through 12 students taught by the graduates of accredited programs. What are your take, panelists, on using this test score data? And we'll start with Segun at the NEA.
Sure. I think the key is the value-added controversy can really take us on a right-hand turn toward a rabbit hole that would be significant only if we overvalue that above and beyond so many more things in which need to be part of the measurement, right? If we're going to measure, a baseball player only by, his batting average and not by the 25 other metrics that matter, then we start getting into trouble. So when I don't know what's going to come out with the federal government, but when you look at both what CAPE has done and even what CADE and NCTQ has done, is said we're going to bring a compilation of evidence, and if we're going to bring test scores into it, then how are we going to value test scores as compared to a whole lot of other outcomes measures? I think it's becoming valid to ask, and CAPE is starting to ask that as well. How many of your graduates actually go into teaching? How many of them stay for an extended period of time? What are the evaluation results? More holistically than just the test score results, what are the evaluation results of your teachers? So there's a whole lot of ways in which we can measure the performance outcomes of programs that could have an element of that. But if we overvalue it, then we go down a controversial road that I don't think is particularly valuable.
Value add is such a complicated thing. For example, there are 4 states now where you can get data on the value-added programs. So there are people here from Louisiana, Tennessee, Ohio, or North Carolina. So one of our standards is, do those programs contribute to student learning, right? And we can only use data from one state, North Carolina, because the rest of the states aggregate the data at the institution level, which makes it absolutely irrelevant to anyone who wants to use that data. So,
And that's because
an institution has multiple programs.
so you have elementary ed, you have special ed,
Yeah.
you have
Right, so you have multiple programs, and if I'm running the undergraduate elementary program, it has no relationship to the graduate elementary program. I don't think people appreciate how dramatically different, have different admission standards, different course requirements, different everything. So what you're saying about the graduate and the undergraduate combined, you don't know what to do with that data. So we can only use North Carolina. And then we can only use, then we're looking for a program where there are statistically significant scores. Well, there are almost none. I think we had 1 or 2 programs in the entire sweep of the nation for which we could use value added. So value added makes sense, it's intuitive. Like when I talk to funders, they're like, well, yeah, all your inputs, it's fine, but all we care about is the outputs. I'm like, yeah, so you think I don't care about the outputs? But the problem is measuring those outputs is really, really tough, really tough.
Jim, when I was covering the CAPE standards as they were going through, this was an incredible area of controversy. There were many people within the field that, did not want CAPE to put in an explicit requirement that programs try to measure this. Why do you think there was so much controversy? In other words, what were people that didn't like this idea afraid of?
It's a big shift, not only methodologically, but conceptually, away from measuring teaching quality to measuring teacher effectiveness in working with P-12 students, P-12 student learning. This is the shift that is occurring, and I think has to occur. It's a very, very important one, and it's going to take us some time, I think, to develop the array of evidence measures that will help us in that regard. And so our standards, I think, are ahead of where the field is, either in collecting these data or in some cases really developing the constructs that show validity and reliability. So our focus is on multiple measures. I think it will always be required that we have multiple measures because no one of these, as any psychometrician will tell you, is 100% valid. There are limitations to all of these. And the other thing I'd want to say is that this is really not a substitute for looking at student learning within the program itself. We require that the programs demonstrate that their candidates can have a positive impact on student learning before they leave. And why is this? Because you have an attribution problem if you're just looking at impact. Once that candidate leaves as a graduate and is out in the classroom, maybe for the first couple of years, you can make inferences back to the program and what the program did to create that performance in the classroom. But even then, there are confounding factors. So you really want to not only look at impact, but you really want to look at what's happening in the program itself, where you don't have that attribution kind of program or problem. It's the interaction, I think, between impact and what happens in the program that creates the continuous improvement cycle that we want the programs to use. So that would be my take at it. And the other thing I'd want to say about value added, the limitations and the problems with value added in measuring individual teacher performance are somewhat mitigated when you use this for program evaluation. The American Statistical Association has said this, the American Psychological Association. So CAPE is not out in the wilderness advocating these things.
Because the data is aggregated up to a larger
Yes.
sample size and.
Yes.
Okay. So there is a real fear out there that as we raise standards for teacher preparation programs, not just with selection but also coursework rigor, that essentially we'll cut the supply of candidates of color, which I mean is already in short supply, as we talked a little bit about yesterday. How do you address this problem of, we want higher standards, but then we also don't want to end up with a teaching force that looks even less like the students that we're going to teach? So then you want to maybe start?
Sure. And this is an issue, as you know, I've spent a lot of time in my career trying to address, and I think there are probably several challenges in the process. I mean, one of the most direct challenges doesn't have much to do with things like higher standards for program accreditation, except in looking at the gap among teachers of color in the paper and pencil standardized tests for teacher preparation. Be they whatever the test is that you're using in your state, for either the test of basic skills in the front end, for which there is a significantly large gap in performance among Black and Latino teachers and their white and Asian counterparts, or later on in the program in the subject matter tests, for which there are gaps, but they tend to be smaller. When you start looking at expanding better and broader clinical experiences, when you start looking at grade point averages, for which there are some gaps, but they're smaller, some of the other standards in which you can develop, you start lengthening the time of the length of the program for students who have lower achievement but are going to have a higher outcome. There are a bunch of different ways you can do it. The other one that I still think holds a great deal of promise for both this and some of the previous parts you talked about is the idea about how a candidate demonstrates that they actually can teach before they enter the classroom through a more authentic performance-based assessment. There are a number of them being developed across the country, a bunch of them that are being piloted. Early data on that shows little to no gap based on race. When you really go to a teacher in their classroom and see
to be
how
clear,
they're interacting.
these are exams where somebody's actually teaching and
Right.
being observed and.
They're performance-based exams. The teaching, they're being observed. Teachers are putting together portfolios of student work. They're looking at how they're impacting student learning. They're developing something that's significantly more comprehensive than you would get from
A practice
a
or-
paper and pencil
Right.
multiple choice exam. And those exams tend, at least in their early research, show significantly less achievement gaps. So if we started using that a lot more, it could show a lot of promise.
Jim, what do you think? What do you think colleges are going to have to do, especially on like the recruitment side, with respect to, not just having better quality candidates, but better quality candidates of color?
Yes, and we approach it as a problem of improving the academic ability of the candidate pool, because we've slipped as a country in that regard due to changes in the labor force, positive changes, but that have had an effect on the pool of entering teachers. And it's also a diversity problem. We have been seeing greater diversity in the pool, but often because of alternative preparation programs that do recruit much more strategically than traditional university-based programs. I think the problem is that university-based programs, by and large, have not seen themselves as having to recruit. They haven't worked closely with the school districts that they serve to reach down into the high schools and even the middle schools to develop that pool of future teachers. And incidentally, Phi Delta Kappa has a national program where it's really starting to do this strategically. I think we need to recognize, too, that the pool of, let's say, African Americans who are college graduates is too small. And only roughly 7% of the graduates are African American. So when you have such a small pool, you're inevitably, it's going to be a zero-sum game. It's a recruitment problem that you've got to somehow solve. Carolyn Hawksby, an economist at Stanford, has studied this problem and demonstrated that we have lots of very highly qualified students of color who either do not go to college or who go to colleges far below the caliber of college to which they're entitled. So we approach it as a recruitment problem. I don't think it's something we're going to solve overnight, but we're deluding ourselves if we think that the present level of performance around diversity is adequate. We are really losing ground relative to the diversity of the adult population in our country, and certainly the diversity of the P-12 student population. So CAPE's view is, we can't rest on our laurels. We have to try some different things.
I want to talk for a minute about alternative certification, because we've mostly focused on traditional university-based preparation, but as you know, many teachers come in through other routes. And so, Segun, I'm going to point this to you first.
Sure.
Because the NEA has made it pretty clear that, it doesn't believe in alternative certification programs where teachers are basically learning on the job. And Kate, your group actually found this past year that most of the alternative programs you study were just as bad, if not worse, than the traditional ones. But then there's, the cynic in me that thinks, well, these programs have been around since, 1981, I think, in New Jersey. I forget which was the first state to do.
New Jersey.
81 in New Jersey, okay. I mean, is it realistic to think that these kinds of programs are going away, given, especially shortages in special ed and math and science, which is where you see a lot of alternative routes?
Sure. So first, NEA is opposed not to alternative routes to teaching, but to bad alternative routes to teaching. We're opposed to bad traditional routes to teaching as well, and we know that there are both of them. And I think part of the challenge, you
But
know,
you would prefer that teachers come in not learning on the job, but having
Right.
had, like,
we would prefer what we coin the teachers are profession ready on day one. So on day one, when you're a teacher of record, you should demonstrate that you have the subject matter knowledge that it takes, you have the pedagogical skills that it takes, and you have the ability to reach the children who are in front of you at that time on day one, not on day 30 or day 60 or day 200. We know that there are significant challenges in that, and part of that is, you know, alternative route programs range as Kate would be able to attest, not, you know, from 6 weeks to, you know, 6 years, and from really robust programs that have very rigorous entry requirements and very rigorous.
It's name, right? Alternative route, because it
And
means
so-
everything on it.
Right, it means everything. And, you know, part of the problem with our profession is, you know, when you go into nursing, whether you go to Harvard or Podunk University, you can pretty much expect a similar experience of what you're expecting to go through. In teaching, again, your program could last 6 weeks, it could last 6 years. You could spend 2 weeks in the classroom before you enter as teacher of record. You could spend a year in a residency program.
You might
And
have
so
a
it
mentor,
varies,
you might
right, you
not
might have a mentor, you
mentor.
might, so it's, you know, often we're trying to kind of use a universal frame to compare compare apples to oranges. I think for us, you know, we continue to point to the fact that, you know, I call them the dueling banjos of research, say alternative certification is good, alternative certification is bad. When you look at school districts that have a choice of who to select, they almost always and exclusively choose fully licensed candidates from good programs. And so what we fail to do is really begin to identify who's coming through these alternative route programs, where they're teaching, and what impact they're having. We're beginning to again, the dueling banjos are beginning to see some of that, but can we do something like really rigorously use a performance assessment that shows, I don't care where you came from, but you have to prove from day one that you can teach, and if you can't, we're gonna call you something different.
So
We're gonna
let's
call you an
say-
intern, we're gonna do something different.
Let's say a state required every teacher, no matter the preparation route, to pass one of these performance-based assessments. Would NEA be sort of okay with the idea that, okay, you know, all of those teachers have demonstrated some level of skill, and, you know, we think any of them, you know, we would sort of give them our seal of approval or whatever.
Right, yes, that's what NEA said from that right now, too many of the teachers who are learning on the job are doing it in America's highest need schools. They're here in Detroit. They're in, you know, I talk about my other job as school board chair in the state of Maryland. There are alternative certified teachers in 2 counties, in Baltimore City and in Prince George's County. And those happen to be the places with the largest numbers of poor kids, the largest number of kids of color, the largest number of kids who are getting the least out of their public education experiences. And so how do you kind of begin to at least have a more honest dialogue about that?
Kate?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with, remarkably, I agree with everything Segun's saying, really. I mean.
Remarkably.
Yeah, I mean, I don't, you know, certainly I was a huge proponent of alternative certification for much of my professional career, and really came to a different decision the more I learned about what formal teacher preparation could be providing, but not. So the only caveat I would add to what Segun's saying is that as long as we have so many programs which are not delivering what teachers need, I'm just fine with a district choosing to go with Teach for America, and there's no evidence that Teach for America ever causes harm compared to the teacher that would otherwise be in that classroom. And there's evidence that in mathematics and at the secondary level, there's clear advantages. So, you know, in 15 years, I'm going to say I want to totally agree with Segun, but until we turn a system that, I don't think people understand just how broken the system of teacher education is in the United States. And we spend all this time talking about evaluation and all these other reforms, when countries that have really seized upon the problems within their education systems, like Singapore, like Finland. People, I mean, you get sick to death of hearing about Finland, right? But do you know the first thing Finland did? They shut down their ed schools and started them all over again in the 70s. That's the first thing they did. Do you ever read about that? No. Poland, I mean, the systems that have really turned the education systems around have changed who goes into the profession and what happens to them before they go into the classroom. So we have to do that. Anybody here from Texas? Your alternative certification programs are a scandal. I mean, they are an absolute scandal. They're the only programs in the United States which are for profit. It's the only state that allows it. And they are simply taking money out of people's pockets and giving them nothing in return. I mean, that's a story. It's really important to write about.
I remarkably agree with everything Kate just
Yeah.
said.
We're supposed to fight and make this interesting.
I know, but no, I've gotten mellower.
All right, so I'm going to ask one more question just along these lines. I mean, I once tried to do Finland has about 8, I think, teacher preparation programs for a population of 4 million. We have,
Oh, I have to give my favorite statistic.
Okay.
Okay, this is my favorite new one.
But then I get to give mine.
Okay.
Yeah, you're the moderator.
Singapore last year hired all of its new teachers from one institution. New York City is twice as big. Okay, it's twice as big. It hired all of its new teachers from 300 institutions. Now, you tell me as a school district how you can begin to control the quality of new teachers you're receiving when you're hiring from 300 institutions. If you adjust for population, like China doesn't even begin. It has about 15% of what we have. I mean, it's unbelievable. We have way too many programs. The right stats are in our report. I don't have it, but
I think it's about 1,400 schools of ed.
we have
Even more.
1,350
we have more, but some of them produce
institutions.
literally 1,
Right.
2, 3 teachers a year, so
Right.
I always sort of chop those off.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
But
We have way too many.
I tried to do back of the envelope math, and it came out about 3 times as many per population as Finland.
So we have a table in our latest teacher prep review that compares us to about 6 or 7 countries and the number of program institutions we have compared, and there's nobody else like us.
So the bottom line here is that we have probably too many programs. I don't know, maybe labor economists would argue with me because
Yeah,
we are
I
such a
think so.
broad country and we have much more regional labor markets. But let's take for the moment that we have too many programs. Why aren't states closing these? Why, and are we prepared to shutter programs that either don't meet state standards, don't meet CAPE standards, or are unable to produce teachers that can pass a performance licensing test?
Well, ultimately, this is a state responsibility. States have constitutional authority in this matter. They can close programs. CAPE can't. We can revoke accreditation, and they can decide to keep a program open. And some states have done this. Now,
And why do you think they've done this?
I think the political dynamics become very provincial very rapidly. There's pressure from the local legislator, perhaps from the governor, to keep these programs open. It's a little like trying to close a school.
Because they're constituent.
Right. Now, the Council of Chief State School Officers, which represents all of the 50 state superintendents and commissioners, has said that really we ought to hold all programs to the same set of standards and that we ought to close weak programs. So from a national level, we're seeing much more push than we have in the past for states to get serious about this. But it's a variable landscape out there. And I see it as a twofold program. Cut off the weak programs, and there certainly are those out there, but also make the programs that are sort of just operating at a minimally adequate level much better. You've got to raise the whole distribution upward, and that is a challenge for the states as well, because traditionally they have not focused on building capacity and encouraging continuous improvement. It's been a very traditional regulatory model that's really quite weak.
Anyone want to add add to that, or should
They're
we turn it
chickens.
over?
Right, look, we could, after all the talk about research and best practice, it comes down to politics and money, right? And influence. And I think part of what Jim hit on the nail on the head, we haven't asked these programs to meet rigorous standards yet.
Well, we haven't even
They-
agreed on
right,
what
we
the
have-
standards are. I
Right,
mean,
so, but if we, whatever they are, I don't care if there's 30 different standards in 30 different states, if they're high and rigorous, right? We say that about kids. If we're not asking kids to perform well, we don't really yet know how many of these, we know there are a whole bunch of bad programs out there. We don't know that if we said, hey, get your stuff together or close down, how many of them are gonna respond to that call. So I think the real key is, are we gonna be serious about really pushing high and rigorous standards? It'd be nice if they're uniform, and if every institution needed to be CAPE accredited, and every institution had high outcome standards, and Kate was having a real hard time trying to find the few on the bottom rather than the few on the top like she's doing. But we haven't really pushed yet, and organizations like Kate are making us do that.
I mean, I used to think that the answer here was to shut down a whole bunch of programs. And I mean, I still think a lot need to be shut down, don't get me wrong, but I no longer put my eggs in that basket. I mean, I don't see it as politically tenable. I mean, look what happened in Louisiana. They tried desperately to shut down one program, the state school chief down there, based on really good value-added data showing it was just a terrible program. And they just couldn't muster up the political fortitude to shut down a single program with really good evidence. So, and the real problem, I think, is that the field doesn't think, that it's not just that there is incompetence in the field, which is what I used to think also, that people just weren't that good at their jobs. So you had a field of professionals that weren't that good at preparing teachers. But the real problem is the field, the predominant view within the field of teacher preparation is, and this is led by the ones everyone thinks are the best, the Research One institutions, that their job is not to train teachers. Training is a bad word. And does that make sense to you? But it's absolutely the truth. They think their job is to form a teacher. Their job is to develop in you the intuition to be able to lead a classroom. And so there is a deep philosophical divide that I know that Jim is personally trying to push up against and trying to get them to embrace a training model. But it isn't just a matter of some programs being bad. It's a matter of a field which is dominated by a view that says our job is not to train you. That's beneath us. And that's the
That's true.
fundamental
They
issue.
get very upset if you call us teacher training.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
true.
It's true.
Yeah.
They get very upset.
Well, you get calls from people when you put it in the story.
Yeah, if you put training in the story, you'll get a call right away, absolutely.
Yeah, so I don't think people have
Very
written
true.
about this. I didn't even understand it a couple of years ago. When you start, it's an articulated view. I can point research that's written by teacher educators, and Jim, you'd agree, where they say, we got rid of the training module. It underestimated our value to the field.
But I think the dynamic is pushing in the other direction, toward a much more clinical model.
Hope so.
But the legacy here is that the schools of education, in some cases, came out of normal schools. When they went into universities, they tried to look like an arts and sciences college rather than a law school or a medical school. They didn't buy a
vocational,
right. They
right,
didn't
right.
buy a professional model, and we haven't destroyed that legacy. And I do think you have to destroy it
Yeah,
to get where we need to go. We're not going to reform the model by just tacking on a few additional field experiences.
Right.
You know, it's
I think the best way to learn this is, do you guys know about Doug Lamoff's book, Teach Like a Champion? Bestseller. I mean, teachers bought it in droves. They got it as graduation gifts, all this stuff. All right, ask a teacher educator if they would ever teach Doug Lamoff on their campus and get their reaction. Because they'll say, over my dead body, would I ever allow that book on my campus? 9 times out of 10. Because they think it's teaching a bag of tricks.
All right, I just want to give everyone a hand, because this is a really complicated area, and I think we covered a lot of ground.